here at the Shorenstein Center with Dori Maynard, and the first thing I want to ask you, Dori, is when is the first time that you met the internet, and what was going on, and what was your response?
I think the first time I met the internet was probably in the early 90s. My father was an early adapter. He actually, very interestingly, went from a manual typewriter straight to a computer. And when he met the computer, he completely fell in love. Completely. And he was on those early chat rooms, the Well, I don't know if you remember those. And so he, in 1992, I believe, he sold the Open Tribune. But leading up to the sale, and then really, particularly after the sale, he was so excited about what the internet was going to mean, the way he put it, for new deliveries for the news. And he, Nancy and Eric Newton were busy, really planning these new projects that were going to take advantage of what they then called convergence. And so I think he really saw this very much as an opportunity. It was not at all, you know, I think some of his colleagues viewed the internet with some suspicion, but he absolutely did not. And, you know, in part, I think during the last few months of his life, he was very ill. And so the internet, he used it very much the way people use it now. It was his lifeline to the world, to news, and he really thought that that's... I just bumped into somebody who said, you know, your father was telling us in the late 80s that one day we were going to get our news on the computer. And we all thought he was crazy.
Now, what did you... Now, so those were his thoughts. Now, what did you think as you started to become aware of the emerging technology?
My thought very early on was, this is very exciting, and we are in clear danger of replicating what's happened in the traditional media.
Which is? Which
is a majority of white journalists trying to cover a multicultural community. I became, 1994, I came here to the first conference I think the Neiman's did on the emerging technology. And I left wondering, something just was bothering me. And I finally realized it was because I only saw one person of color there on the panel. And I thought, okay, at the Institute, where I was not, you know, in any big position, but we began having conversations there that we need to prepare journalists of color, and we need to try to change the conversation.
And what was the sense of whether the technology would enable more opportunity for journalists of color, or was there what was your sense of how the structure was being perceived?
So my concern about the structure was what you heard when you tried to raise the issue of race in the coming technology. What you heard was, oh no, the internet's going to solve all this. Race and gender will no longer matter. This is going to be a race and gender neutral world. So here we had a chance back then when we really could have built in structures that ensured that we were as inclusive as possible. Instead, the people driving the conversation told us, don't worry your pretty little head about that. This is all going to be taken care of. And what we ended up doing was replicating the structure of the traditional media. Now at the Institute, we were very early to make sure that we were training people what we call cross-media, and making sure that people were as prepared as possible. And yet, what we also kept hearing, very much reminiscent to the 1960s, is we'd love to hire some people of color. We just can't find any qualified. Meanwhile, you had people like David Ellington, who started Net Noir, which was an online site really catering to the African American audience. You had Levon Lukey, who in 1995 started Latino Link. So there were people who were very active, Stephen Chin and Bruce Kuhn. Steve Chin founded Monkey King Media. And they were very much part of the mix and very much not part of the conversation.
So there were, now we're talking sort of mid-90s,
Mid-90s.
So there were some startups that came out of the community, which you just discussed. What about the traditional, quote unquote, sort of minority or Black Latino press? How did that digital disruption start to affect them? I mean, as
well, the disruption in the Black press really happened in the 1960s with some of the integration after the riots, and the white-owned media realized that they needed to have Black people to cover the biggest story facing the nation. That was really more of a disruptor.
I see.
And now, as a result of the internet, you do have sort of the equivalency of the Black press and the Latino press, Asian press, and Native American press. All kinds of rich websites that are out there.
So talk a little bit about your role with the Institute, and if you would, just discuss a little more about like what sorts of skills you began seeing the need to train journalists in, and how that went, and if you can remember, do you have some anecdotes about actually, friction
there was, yes. We have a program that it was our signature program called the editing program, and it had a very strong board of advisors who had really nurtured this program, from the Washington Post, the New York Times, really great people. And when we decided that we needed to change the program, when the Institute board and leadership decided that they needed to change the program, it was a huge battle with our advisory board, many of whom, or editing program advisory board, many of whom quit. They just believed that we needed to focus on the fundamentals of copy editing, of headline writing, and we were saying, well, yeah, but this world is changing, and we really, really need to start giving people, there was a lot of experimentation. Is it coding? Is it, but we knew we had to prepare our graduates to meet the growing demands of the job. I think history has shown that we were right, but yes, that was a couple of years of very painful friction with people who had been big supporters of ours.
When roughly were those years of real tension?
I have to say they were mid to late 90s. Mid to late 90s. And I can get back on that. I'd actually forgotten that until you mentioned that, there was a friction.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm glad we surfaced it. So let's talk about the experience of journalists of color in newsrooms, sort of post emergence of the web. What's the feedback that you've gotten in the past decade? How have
one of the things that happened was that the technology did disrupt the business model. And what ended up happening as a result of the disruption of the business model was that a lot of news execs said, well, we must work on the business model. Diversity is a luxury that we can't address right now. And the number of journalists of color that are leaving the industry has been just a much higher rate than white journalists. We know that the industry is contracting, but for journalists of color, it's contracting at a higher rate than it is for our white peers.
And what explains that?
Those are some good questions. Studies have shown that part of what explains that is that journalists of color feel that there's no room for advancement, and that when we come with our story ideas, we're hired because we have a different outlook at things. And then when we come with our story ideas, we're told, no, that's not a story. And so just that sort of the frustration of not being able to do your best work, I think, has a lot to do with it.
So let's, if we could, let's talk just a little bit more about what the kinds of programs that the Institute has been doing in recent years.
So one of the programs that we do, we have our diversity framework that looks at diversity through the prisms of race, class, gender, generation, and geography. And so we've been doing, and we think that those 5 things shape our perceptions of ourselves, each other, events around us, and that they're necessary tools to help you in your coverage, because you need to look at stories and say, what does this look like across the 5 fault lines? So we've been doing a lot of work around that, and we use a lot of what's going on online to as our example. So Politico did a story that last September, before the first debate, that looked at Pennsylvania, and the story was, Romney's secret. Pennsylvania may be, something he could win. So I read the story. It was a 3-jump story, and as you may know, Pennsylvania was ground zero for voter ID laws, which some people feared were going to suppress the vote. 3-jump story, they never mentioned it once. And so we use that as an example of if they had looked at what that story looked like across race or across class or across generation, it might have been harder for them to leave that out. So that's something that we're spending a lot of time going to newsrooms. We're also really trying to teach people how to use Twitter more effectively. Because the argument we hear is, well, people can't get out of the newsrooms. You can use Twitter to really find out about what's going on in communities other than your own across your community in more effective ways. And it's almost like eavesdropping on private conversations. So we're spending a lot of time trying to help people use Twitter. And then we did, to the question of what ended up happening, with this disruption that really only disrupted the business model, but not the way we tell stories. We spent a couple of years doing content audits of some of the online sites that have risen up, Slate, Salon, Huffington Post, Daily Beast, just looking at how people of color are portrayed. And what we found was, again, very similar to the traditional media. African Americans, primarily crime, sports, entertainment. Latinos, episodic coverage of immigration. And then Native Americans and Asian Americans apparently just don't contribute to the daily fabric of our lives. And that's what's happening in the new media. So we're spending some time trying to raise that issue. And there was one time on the Daily Beast where the only story about people of color, story that included people of color, was on a feature on grunting tennis stars. Really? I actually could have been left out of that one.
So talk more about Twitter and its how it may be changing information flows and maybe giving more voice to
I think Twitter is one of the most exciting things I've seen, because I think I mentioned earlier that the only thing that was disrupted by the technology that I can see was the business model, but not the stories we're telling or the way we're telling stories. We're not using the new tools to tell new stories. But Twitter and the power of the hashtag, that really does surface things in ways that stories that might not otherwise get attention are getting attention. So I go back to March 16th, 2012, when I was glued to the Twitter watching 2 separate conversations. Mike Daisy had just admitted that he fabricated part of the story he told on the factory in China that produces a lot of Apple goods. He told that on This American Life, and so he had just admitted he fabricated part of that story. And many of the white men who are the press sort of critics and they were just deep into that conversation. On the other side, or on another conversation, was people like Roland Martin and Goldie Taylor and Torrey and Charles Blow. They were deep in a conversation about what was, for most people, an unknown young man named Trayvon Martin, who had been shot while he went home. Well, we all know the story now, but that was unknown. I knew it, but it was not really breaking out of the African American community. And I watched that day of those 2 conversations really very intense, deep conversations, never intersected, but by the but the pushing of, or the intensity around Trayvon Martin meant that that following Saturday, this was a Friday, Saturday or Sunday, I can't remember, Don Lemon had some people on CNN to talk about it, and then by Monday it was all over the news. It was on the Today Show, and that was the beginning. And I think the hashtags have the opportunity to push things in ways that we wouldn't otherwise hear about.
I want to circle back to that, to the idea that that in the disruption, well, I should say, I'll put it a different way. Anytime you have sort of chaos or disruption,
Mm-hmm.
there's opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seemed, one thing that we keep, as we've interviewed people, that we keep hearing is that things might have gone a different way, that, whether that means in terms of the business model, but also in terms of the kinds of coverage and the
Mm-hmm.
kinds of, editorial budgets and whatnot. Are there any key decision points that you might identify that that could have sort of gone a different way within the business? And
Well, I mean, there was, I can't remember what year it was, but I mean, it was probably early 2000s, and this is just the business model. I was talking to a publisher of a major news organization who said, well, at least thank God Craigslist isn't in Des Moines. And I was at my computer, and I was like, no, Craigslist is, and I started, I started listing all the places that Craigslist was. I didn't get very far, because it was like, okay. But it was like, wow. So I think that was, even in the 2000s, people were trying, instead of adopting this technology, they were saying it's going to go away. So that's one key. I also think, and I think this persists, the inability to understand that you need to create coverage that is relevant and reflective if you're ever going to get your mass audience back. I think that that's something that people still have a hard time with. If you're going to give a very narrow slice, which I think, crime, sports, entertainment, immigration, and don't exist, and then put up a paywall. I mean, I'm going to go on your site if it's free, but are you really going to ask me to pay to be insulted and ignored? That probably isn't going to happen. So, I think this idea that diversity is still a luxury instead of a business strategy, that is going to continue to mean that we're going to have very niche publications, and people are betting on sort of white wealth is going to be their savior. I think people need to be a little broader.
another thing I'd like to come back to, if your dad were here, at seeing the landscape as it is in 2013, what do you think he'd say?
I think so this is the 20th anniversary of his death. Yeah. And one of the things that we've been doing at the Institute is we're getting ready to do sort of online commemoration, because he was so enthusiastic about the internet, that to do a brick and mortar, I mean, that one thing he would say is, why would you do a brick and mortar? The other thing we've been doing is we've been going through his old speeches and his writing, and we post a quote a day. And so many of the quotes that he said back then are relevant now. So I think, to the point of, we need, if we expect to grow it as an industry, we need to reflect our communities. I think he would still, he would say that. I think he would say, I think the big thing is he would have ripped everything up. I mean, and really, I think he would have a hard time understanding why people weren't ripping up the model and starting something different. I think he would be baffled that the news industry that he loved so much had made so little progress, both in terms of the technology it was using and in terms of the ability to cover the communities.
So one question we've also been asking interviewees is, is the kind of traditional sort of forward spin question, which is, where do you, when you wake up in 10 years, where do you expect things to be? And maybe also appropriate, where do you hope they'll be?
You know, I was thinking about that on the way over, and my hope is that in the next year that we can change the conversation around the coverage of communities of color from one where we're all really embracing the notion that to live up to our moral and ethical obligations, that instead of distorting the lives of people of color, we're telling the true story, and that that we're no longer so terrified of the coverage, but that we're all engaged in creating these new models. Because, as you know, people of color over-index on mobile. I mean, the audience is there. So instead of running from that audience, I hope that we are really fully embracing it and making sure that we are including people of color in not only our news coverage, but also our business models, because we should be going to the customers and figuring out how do they want to use these. Yeah. So that's, and that people are understanding because of the ferocity of the internet.
Yeah.
That, it used to be that you, like, Time Magazine, and this is true for Time Magazine. Time Magazine did a piece this Father's Day online where they had dads write letters to their daughters. And they included no African American, Asian American, or Native American fathers, not one. Now, have you looked at Time circulation lately? I have. It's just going down, 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 down. And the reason I suspected it was going down was because there was no uproar over this. I mean, I wrote something, but you didn't hear about it. But when things are really important to people and people are putting out one-dimensional pieces, the uproar and the blowback after the fact is so intense that my hope is that that's part of what's going to get people to embrace in this next year. I know that's an ambitious, but we want to have diversity, because when we front-load diversity, then we don't end up having to figure out and apologize, and our conversation isn't steered from what we wanted to talk about, rather to, why weren't women and people of color included. So I think my hope is that everyone's going to begin to see what's in it for them, and it's a better product.
Well, to that point, so are there any particular media projects right now that are taking advantage of that over-indexing on social, that rich dialogue and enthusiasm for technology that is in the Black and Latino communities that we know about? Are there any particular projects that you're aware of that are sort of making a business model out of that engagement enthusiasm?
I'm not seeing anything.
At least with the legacy media, but maybe with other sort of new emerging projects that you find exciting or interesting?
I'm not seeing any. I mean, I'm seeing some, I love some of the sites that cater solely to an ethnic audience. Right. And I love some of those voices, but I guess you could argue Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a platform.
But no, I'm not seeing anybody who says, the other thing is the multicultural nature. I mean, that's the thing that I'm a little concerned about, because I don't want to just have my story. I also want to read about you and my Latino colleagues and friends. Yep. So that place where everything's all together, I'm not.
Are you pessimistic or hopeful at the end of the day?
I'm hopeful because, I'm very hopeful because I think that the hashtag allows us to surface new voices. It amplifies some of the voices. I think going to a single website and creating a website where I have to go to get to that voice, that's a model that I think continues to silo us. But a hashtag where I can amplify my voice, and then, or, you amplify my voice, I amplify your voice, and we start raising stories, I think that makes me hopeful. I also hope, because I think, and it's one of the things that we spend time at the Institute trying to help people do, is how do we have these conversations that are constructive across difference? So my hope is that, I know sometimes Twitter can get a little out of control, but that there are people there who will keep those conversations constructive and on point, so that we begin to really talk with each other and not at each other.
Fantastic. I hope that comes to pass.
If I weren't hopeful, I wouldn't get out. I mean,
Yeah.
Do I get discouraged? Sure. Do I get sort of in the privacy of my own little, not even the office, but, car, do I get a little, yeah, of course I do. But if I weren't helpful, I would definitely go into another business.